Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The New Frontiers of Identity. I'm Kirby Orozco and I'll be your moderator for today. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit them into the Q&A panel, and we'll answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded, and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. Joining us today is Paul Trulove, Chief Product Officer. We've got a lot to cover today, so with that, Paul, I'll pass this over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Kirby. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about how identity governance can help keep organizations secure and compliant before, during, and after a digital transformation. You know, unfortunately, we live in a world where data breaches are the new normal, and it's getting worse, not better, as digital transformation accelerates into more and more organizations and deeper within the organization's business processes. You know, the reality today is that most organizations expect to be breached. The reality is I'm also still searching for the two people that said no to this question. I'd like to buy them a drink when they're breached because they're going to need it. Not only are breaches a reality, but the unfortunate fact is the direct financial loss after a breach occurs continues to climb significantly and really is expected to grow over the next several years. If we look at some data on this, Gemalto's Breach Level Index report from 2017 showed that almost 8 billion records were exposed. And those were only the reported and publicized ones. I actually shudder to think about the real number. And I think as we turn our attention towards 2019, we should all expect this number to grow, as there have been some significant and very high-profile breaches, and probably a lot more that have actually flown under the radar. One of the things that has changed over the past several years is that now no industry is safe. And I'm sure our friends in the financial services sector are probably thinking, gosh, it's about time that somebody else got targeted. All kidding aside, while no one should be surprised by this information, the question we should be asking is, as identity and access management practitioners and IT security practitioners, are we doing enough? Well, unfortunately, the regulators don't think so. In 2018, the pressure to comply, with what I call the alphabet soup of international regulations has increased. And while our friends Sarbanes-Oxley practically created the original identity governance market a little over 10 years ago, privacy regulations are really pushing it to the next level. And I think it's critical when talking about PII-specific regulations to understand that it's not just about GDPR, and even if it is about GDPR, it's not just about your European entities. In many cases, I think people have really struggled to understand the full scope of privacy regulations, and that's one of the things I think we're all going to have to do a better job of in 2019. When you think of the sheer volume and complexity of the regulatory compliance environment, it's really no surprise that the cost of implementing a compliance program continues to grow significantly year over year. And the reason that the cost grows is that the cost of non-compliance is actually greater. In fact, about 3 times greater as it turns out. And so as long as the penalty for non-compliance continues to rise, your organization's appetite for compliance risk will decrease, further driving up the cost of compliance. But data breaches and compliance aren't the only challenges we're facing as an industry. The very nature of our businesses is changing. The pressure to digitize the enterprise is ever present and growing in importance as our individual businesses push the boundaries to compete and deliver value to their customers and shareholders. With the rapidly expanding digital revolution come new frontiers for identity. And if we're not prepared, a lot of the work that we've accomplished as an industry over the last decade may quickly unravel. But you're here today, which means you're going to be ready. So let's talk about what you need to be ready for. The new frontiers of identity are our growing and changing user populations, our rapidly evolving and increasingly hybrid cloud and on-prem application environments, and finally data. It's morphing into new formats and moving into new locations. But identity governance should be at the core of how you evolve your security and compliance programs to address these new frontiers. So let's look at how each frontier presents a unique identity governance challenge to the IAM teams in attendance today. At the same time, we'll look at how each frontier offers the opportunity to help your business grow in both a secure and compliant way. The way I look at it is that security is the enabling technology in digital business transformation, but identity is actually the foundation from which it all will start. All right, so starting with the user frontier is an appropriate place, since identity governance really begins with the digital identities that we have to manage, both inside and outside of our enterprise boundaries. Traditionally, we have focused on three types of users. Hopefully, most of you are focusing on at least these three types of users. Employees were always the starting point for most identity programs, especially back in the early days of provisioning when we were predominantly looking at the efficiency of onboarding and offboarding across our major application environments. Over the course of the stronger focus on governance, we started to add contractors and partners, and so we really expanded into the core, user communities that our organizations, have accessing internal systems. And so, those were the things that predominantly required identity governance for the major things that we cared about in the enterprise. Well, that was until the world became more digital, and now if we think about it, identities, if you will, are no longer limited to just humans. We now have non-human identities that are interacting with a wide variety of enterprise applications and data. In fact, just a few months ago, Google demonstrated a software bot that actually called a human to schedule a haircut appointment. And it was able to do this in a very dynamic way where, as the human responded to the questions that the bot was asking, it would dynamically decide what needed to happen next. And it was just a small example of how rapidly technology is changing the way that we have to think about everything, especially identity, because the access required to enable that chat bot to function in a dynamic voice recognition environment is pretty significant. And I would venture to guess that if I asked for a virtual show of hands today in the webinar, which I realize would be difficult, we would probably confirm this. In fact, I asked this question just a few weeks ago at the Gartner Identity and Access Management show in Las Vegas. And approximately 70% of the audience raised their hands. Didn't surprise me at all. I've actually met with a wide variety of organizations around the world, and a common business initiative in many of them is automating repetitive processes with software bots. What surprised me when I asked that question, when I actually asked the next question, which was, how many of you are actually leveraging your identity governance program to govern the access of bots? Less than 5% of that same audience raised their hands. Pretty disappointing in a lot of ways, right? Because I think we've gotten good controls in place over a majority of our identities, but we're not keeping pace with the way that the businesses are changing and using new technologies, and that's a problem. In some ways, it would be akin to me saying, hey, you're hiring contractors, but you're not managing their access. Imagine having to tell your auditors that. And so when we start to look at this, in a little bit more specificity, and the specific types of business operations that we're seeing bots perform, it's pretty obvious that the required access to perform some of these tasks is exactly the kind of access that we want to protect the most. And so I can't imagine a situation where, if you had a human who had access to a system to extract data, potentially chat online with a customer and collect their personally identifiable information, validate API keys, or even disperse a loan, that you wouldn't govern that access. And so not governing bot access really drives a critical hole in your visibility and in reality your security and compliance programs. So understanding and controlling bot access is just as critical as human access, and in some ways maybe more so. And so this means it's time to expand our view of users to include robots, and especially the software bots that are becoming ever more prevalent in today's enterprise business processes. In fact, SailPoint believes, that this is so important that in Identity IQ 7.3, which was launched earlier this year, we provided out-of-the-box support for software bots. We really believe it's that important. So let's move on to the application frontier. If you thought that the user frontier was interesting, the rapid changes impacting enterprise application environments really take interesting to another level. In many organizations, explosion is probably an understatement. And it's not just the number of applications, but it's actually the access rights in general, which are becoming far more complex and in many cases far more dynamic. This is posing a significant challenge to the way that we think about identity governance in the context of managing users and their access. Another part of the explosion is directly related to the growing number of SaaS applications that are in use by the business. A recent survey by Netscope suggested that large enterprises have more than 1,000 SaaS applications in use today. You know, at first glance, that number actually surprised me. And so I checked with the CIO here at SailPoint, and I found that we have almost 200 active SaaS applications in use in our business. And so when I magnify that, you know, to the size of a large enterprise, maybe 1,000 really isn't that surprising. So I think you, as an identity practitioner, should ask the question, how many SaaS applications are active in your organization? And are you applying your identity governance program and principles to those SaaS applications? My guess would be there are probably more applications in use than you think, and there are probably fewer included in your identity governance program than should be. And so even if your organization isn't on the bleeding edge of cloud, my guess is you will be dealing with this frontier sooner than later. You know, over the next few years, more and more organizations, you know, will really have to turn to the cloud for a variety of both business reasons and technical reasons, and use the cloud to host some of their applications or leverage SaaS applications, you know, where they're completely out of your, you know, direct purview. Speaking of cloud applications, it's not, and the fact that it's not just SaaS applications that are creating the challenge. One of the things that I think is most significant that we've seen from an acceleration perspective over the last several years is this push to get out of the data center. But what that means is a lot of times you're taking a legacy application that has been, you know, hosted in your data center on your, you know, server environments and moving that, you know, directly to a public cloud platform. And in reality, that's actually introduced a lot of new access risks. You probably had good control over your, you know, your platform systems like Linux or Windows. You probably had good control over your database platforms. But how are you governing access to the compute, storage, database, networking components of something like AWS or Azure? Are those things flowing into your identity governance program in the same way? Are you controlling the accounts that the new cloud application platforms are, you know, effectively putting your legacy applications on and creating risk in terms of governing the access to that entire stack? All of a sudden, we really do have a new, more complex platform that must be protected. The growing number of applications in the enterprise, you know, when coupled with the increasingly complex access models, means that we have you know, we have to make it easier to onboard new applications and get them into your identity governance program. And this is something SailPoint recognizes, you know, that is a true challenge for many organizations, because a lot of times the skills that exist in the market for IAM practitioners just aren't where they need to be. We don't have enough people, you know, to just add more capacity to the environment. And so what we're doing is really looking at the way that we onboard applications and that we model entitlements in these new dynamic access models so that we can not only get the information in, but we can get new applications onboarded much, much more efficiently than we have in the past. And so, you know, when we look at simplifying that, you know, part of that has to do with expanding connectivity and making sure that we are holding a lot of the SaaS application providers, we're holding them accountable for opening up their applications so that we can actually manage them from a central identity governance perspective. And so, you know, we want to make sure that it's easy for you to get your applications onboarded and that you have the connectivity that you need to actually drive a comprehensive approach to identity across all your application environments. Which brings us to the final frontier for the discussion, which is around data. And, you know, while the other two frontiers introduce us to some significant changes, I actually think data may be the one that is the most important. You know, when I talk to customers, one of the things that I find is, you know, data is truly one of the most significant areas of risk in the enterprise, and it comes into a risk challenge because a lot of times we are blind to what's actually happening, in the enterprise systems, particularly storage environments, where employees are just putting a lot of information, but nobody's really keeping tabs on what's happening there. And so, when you think about unstructured data stored in files, what we find is the predominant amount of data actually sits outside of your structured applications and database environments, but you haven't necessarily extended your identity controls to those file storage environments, at least not in the same way that you may have a traditional application like SAP or Salesforce. And unfortunately, the more that I talk to organizations about this problem, specifically, governing access to unstructured data stored in files, the more I hear the phrase, what you don't know won't hurt you. It's almost like people are saying, if I don't go look for a problem, then if something bad happens, I don't have to take responsibility to it. I think of this is, very much like the old tale about ostriches hiding their heads in the sand when they're scared. And so if you take one thing away from this discussion today, my recommendation is don't be an ostrich. It's time to address the data problem head on, no pun intended, and really get to a point where you can identify and correct access issues to your unstructured data and realize that it does require a different approach. But you can't afford to stick your head in the sand and ignore it any longer because the risks are too high. And we saw from the cost of compliance when you are breached, financially it can really put your organization in the penalty box. Because all it takes is one breach to impact your organization in a very, very negative way. And the reality is unstructured data is even more likely to be targeted by insiders or sometimes hackers from the outside because of its availability, its portability, and the general lack of security that we continue to see around it. Another challenge that we face around unstructured data stored and filed is the regulatory whirlpool, that alphabet soup that we talked about earlier. Privacy regulations, I think, are going to drive this vortex effect as regulators and auditors apply pressure to control access to all data no matter where it resides. And so as an IAM practitioner, you are going to be called upon, if not already, very soon, to effectively throw a life preserver to the business and help rescue your organization from noncompliance. And your identity team needs to be prepared to do this and help your business teams understand a couple of different things. You need to help them understand where unstructured data resides, especially sensitive unstructured data. You need to help them understand who has access to it and how that access has been granted. And then ultimately, you need to put controls in place to maintain the right level of security around access based on the sensitivity of the information that you're being asked to secure. And I'll ask you a pretty simple question. Are you prepared to do that? Because the only way forward is really to think about identity governance much more comprehensively. I think, most organizations understand the need to govern access to their application environments. And as applications have moved from on-prem data center-centric, out to the cloud and to SaaS, I think most organizations are beginning to think about expanding that purview. But it's long past time to start thinking about your file storage systems, especially those file storage systems that have moved to the cloud, in the same way, and really look at how you can take a comprehensive approach that includes all users, all applications, and all data, within the context of your identity governance processes and program. So I know this probably sounds like a lot of doom and gloom, and in some ways it is. But the new frontiers, while they bring challenges, they also bring opportunities for innovation. And I think one of the most exciting things about being at SailPoint is our continued commitment to innovation. And I think one of the most important ways we will innovate to address the new frontiers of identity is to leverage big data and artificial intelligence and how we approach this growing complexity across both the business and IT infrastructure. Big data platforms give us the ability to collect and view more and more identity data in a much more efficient way, while AI actually provides a lens with which to focus identity governance processes and controls so that we can manage that risk and manage the specific risk, not all of the noise. One of the things that I continue to hear from a lot of SailPoint customers, especially ones with large, very diverse environments, is that the business is almost at a point where they're beginning to drown in, the requirements hoisted upon them from audit. And so one of the things that I think, this modern approach where we take big data and we take AI and we leverage, a lot of the existing processes and controls is the opportunity to really focus it and create automation to help really drive the business back towards managing risk, not managing everything, in the same way. And so that I think is going to really help us, deal with this growing scope that we've talked about across the new frontiers. And the way that I think about AI, is fundamentally around two key value propositions. First, it allows us to govern smarter. And it's taking that risk lens and applying it to all of our identity decisions. And so as the scope of what we have to manage grows, it, as I mentioned, quickly outstrips the ability for the business to govern it effectively. And so, the ability to apply a risk lens actually increases the effectiveness of what we're actually trying to do with identity and access management, which is manage risk. It really does allow us to focus on areas of high risk across our users and our applications and our data, which in turn allows us to do a much better job of actually securing the business and maintaining, conformance with all of the compliance requirements and audit requirements that are out there. But it's not just about risk. Cost continues to be a reality that I think all of our organizations have to face. And so the second value proposition for AI is around efficiency. And it really does go hand in hand, in my opinion, with the idea that we're going to govern smarter by focusing on risk. And so if I think about this at the next level, and I've focused my organization on the things that are truly risky, then a lot of the other things I can just automate, right? And so maybe instead of asking for a manager to review every access change, I only review the ones that the system deems are actually risky. And risk could come from a variety of different formats. It might be the target system you're requesting access to. It might be the types of permission in the target system. It could even be that the user making the request is requesting something that nobody else in their peer group or their department has access to. And that should raise a flag. And those flags should be reviewed by humans so that they can make a good business judgment. But everything else, we shouldn't bog them down with. And so if somebody's requesting access, maybe to an application and a permission within that application that everybody on their team already has, let's just let it go through. We don't even need to ask the manager for their approval. Same thing with certifications. I think a lot of organizations and a lot of business managers in particular get bogged down in the certification process because they have to certify too many things that are ultimately low risk to the organization. And so if we can leverage the system to really flag the anomalies, and that anomaly could be maybe a user not using their access, a user possessing access that is not in line with their peer group, or maybe users using their access out of line with the way that their peers, that's a good problem for us to have management go look at, and we can automatically, kind of robo-certify everything else. So I think AI is truly one of the most exciting areas of innovation that's happening today in identity governance. And while I don't want to position it as a panacea, nothing ever is, I do believe it will have a significant impact on how our industry moves forward to keep pace with the rapid digitalization of the world. And at SailPoint, we will be leveraging AI more and more to drive our IGA processes across the entire open identity governance platform that we provide. SailPoint is very excited to be inventing a future where these new frontiers, users, applications, and data can be comprehensively governed. So as you wrap up 2018 and really look ahead at what's next for your IAM team, don't forget to consider how these new frontiers of identity, that are emerging in your business maybe, more rapidly, maybe a little bit more slowly, but I guarantee they're emerging in some way. But think about how they're accelerating in your enterprise and how you need to change your approach to identity governance to make sure that you can keep your organization secure and compliant. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. What a wonderful presentation. As always, to our audience, you can submit questions to the Q&A panel at any time. We'll go ahead and kick it off with the first question. What types of challenges have you seen in trying to govern access to applications and data when the two operate in different silos?
Yeah, interesting challenge. I think it's much like, anything where when you take a siloed approach, you lose visibility. And one of the things that we're really trying to accomplish in the context of identity governance is that universal visibility. And so if you just imagine a situation where you have a user and they have access to both applications and data stored in files on file storage systems, but you can't give their manager, you can't give the IT security team a complete overview of that person's access. Things like SOD policy administration, even just a base risk assessment becomes more difficult to do. And what can happen is, maybe somebody's only looking at the application environment and they don't realize that person also has access to highly sensitive PII data because it is sitting in a file storage system, and the access on that file storage system isn't folded in. So, I think it really does come down to visibility, but, in addition to the visibility, it's an inability to accurately control risk. And that could even be because you don't have good cross-provisioning processes, and so when that user leaves the organization, their access to their application environments and network accounts may be severed, but the file storage accounts may be retained. And we've all heard the story about the person that leaves an organization but comes back as a contractor and finds that because their organization wasn't taking a holistic approach to identity, they still have a lot of application or, maybe even file storage accounts that they can gain access to as a contractor that maybe they shouldn't have access to in that new role.
Wonderful, thanks. Next question, how does RPA access differ from machine-to-machine service accounts?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. In some ways they are similar, in that, RPAs could be, considered to be, a type of application. I think the difference is most people treat service accounts and can manage service accounts through something like a PAM tool, privileged account management, where they are cataloging those, they're keeping track of them, they're rotating passwords where they need to, whereas a lot of the RPA systems just use basic account access. And so they don't show up within the context of a privileged account management environment. And because they don't necessarily link back to a known identity that might have come in from an authoritative HR feed or maybe a partner repository or a contractor database, they can often look like orphaned accounts. And so then, you either unintentionally remove them because they look orphaned compared to the human accounts, or you just don't manage them and you leave them outside of your identity processes. So more and more what we're seeing, as a best practice is to, integrate with something like a Blue Prism RPA management framework so that we can leverage it to create an authoritative source for identity of those RPAs and then, tag them as such in the context of your identity governance solution. And then you can apply very, specific management processes to them from there forward. I think the key difference is that they don't, you tend to leave them orphaned if you're not careful about how you manage them.
Can you quantify the impact of AI-driven access certifications in terms of what it means to the business?
I think there's a couple of different ways to look at, the likely impact of AI technology to what we're doing in identity governance. I think first and foremost, it's about reducing risk. And so when we think about risk as the impact to an organization of something bad happening, and the likelihood of that happening, what we're actually doing with AI is reducing that second factor. So if I focus my controls on the areas of highest risk, I reduce the likelihood of something happening that I don't want to happen. I probably don't change the impact of it directly, but I'm definitely changing the likelihood. And so, maybe what we do is we take that number, I think it was $4.5 million, as the average cost of a breach. And even if I can just reduce the impact or the likelihood of that happening by 10%, then I begin to significantly reduce the total cost or likelihood, of something bad happening that retains that large number. The other thing that I think is maybe even more critical when we think about AI, and we approach it more from a funding perspective. By reducing the number of things that the business has to look at, that are of low risk, and therefore, I don't need to manage them as aggressively, I can significantly improve the efficiency of my compliance processes, right? I can reduce the number of certification items that a manager has to look at. I can reduce the number of things that have to go for approval. And I think it's pretty easy in your organization to just take a normal cost of a full-time employee, and begin to think about when I reduce those actions, and maybe I take something that used to take an hour for a quarterly access cert, and I reduce that to 15 minutes because I'm focusing on the areas of high risk, and I multiply that out by the number of managers I have and the average cost, of an hour of a manager's time, you can get to a very significant number very, very quickly.
Wow, and we do have one more question. While expanding the list of out-of-box connectors for SaaS applications is a large area to focus on, how is SailPoint helping onboard those legacy, on-prem, and non-AD applications that are disconnected?
Yeah, I think both are very important and very relevant. So on the SaaS side, one of the things that we're really doing is pushing the use of SCIM by the SaaS application providers. And so as more and more of them architect an API model based on SCIM, that makes it much easier for something like SailPoint to connect to them. On the legacy application side, one of the things that we've introduced over the course of the last several months is the Accelerator Pack. And the Accelerator Pack is all about helping you onboard applications, and SaaS applications aren't excluded. It's just that I think you get even more benefit, when you're connecting to your traditional on-prem environments like your mainframes and your ERPs and your legacy applications that, probably have some combination of a platform and database and application account. And the Accelerator Pack allows us to very quickly build the connection, define the workflows, and then implement all of that in the system. The other really critical thing that the Accelerator Pack provides is the ability to do this without a highly technical resource. So instead of somebody that might understand how to write Java code, and could implement a workflow directly, it's more about using a business analyst type of a resource to go in and make the right business decisions, and then the Accelerator Pack automatically generates everything on the back end that goes into the configuration settings. And so it is very complementary to what we're doing just more broadly, trying to build a lot more out-of-the-box capabilities around connectivity and workflows and those kinds of things. But then when you get into a situation where you are implementing, something that does have to be configured, the Accelerator Pack is a great way to, effectively not only accelerate the onboarding process, but expand the resource pool that you have available to do that work, beyond your traditional IAM deployment type resources.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for your time, and thank you, Paul, for the presentation. Keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow, including a recording of today's webinar. We'll also be sending you a solution brief on the new frontiers of identity for you to dive in deeper into this topic and share with interested colleagues. If you'd like to learn more, please contact us using the information on the screen, and we'll get in touch with you and an identity expert. Paul, thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks to everyone who joined us today on the line. Enjoy the rest of your day.